I was 14 years old when my family moved to a small, quiet town in Montana. My father had just gotten a new job, and my parents thought a fresh start in the countryside would be good for us. I wasn't so sure. The house sat at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by miles of dense pine forest. It was old, weathered, and had a certain creaking, groaning personality of its own. The nearest neighbor was at least a mile away, and at night the silence was suffocating. No streetlights, no traffic hum, no distant voices, just the sound of the wind whispering through the trees. At first, the biggest adjustment was Max, our golden retriever. Back in the city, he had been an energetic, happy-go-lucky dog, always wagging his tail and begging for table scraps. But here, he was different. Skittish, on edge. He would sit by the window for hours, staring out into the woods, ears perked up as if listening to something I couldn't hear. And at night, he wouldn't stop growling. The first time it happened, I woke up to a deep, guttural noise coming from the foot of my bed. Max was standing there, his fur bristling, teeth bared at the window. I followed his gaze, but all I saw were the trees, dark and shadowed under the moonlight. "Shh, boy," I whispered, reaching out to stroke his head, but his muscles were tight with tension. I didn't think much of it. New place, new sounds, right? But as the nights passed, Max's behavior only got worse. Some nights, he refused to leave my room. Other times, he would pace near the door, ears twitching, growling softly at nothing. Then we met Mr. Delmar. It was a Saturday morning. My dad and I were outside fixing the sagging wooden fence along the edge of our property when we saw a figure walking up the road. He moved slow, his limp noticeable even from a distance. At first, I thought he might be a neighbor. But as he got closer, I realized I'd never seen someone who looked quite like him before. He was old, maybe late 60s, but something about him felt wrong. His skin was pale, almost grayish, stretched thin over sharp cheekbones. His hair, what little was left, was a patchy mess of stringy white strands, but it was his eyes that unsettled me the most. A pale, milky blue, almost like they were glass. He stopped a few feet from the fence, his mouth twisting into something that could have been a smile, but didn't quite reach his eyes. "Morning," he said. His voice was rough, like gravel grinding together. "Morning," my dad replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Can we help you?" The old man nodded slowly. "You must be the new folks." "That's right," my dad said. "I'm Jim Carter, and this is my son, Ethan." The old man's eyes flicked to me for just a second before resting back on my dad. "Name's Delmar, live down the road a ways." My dad extended a hand, but Delmar hesitated before shaking it. His grip was too firm, too quick, like he was going through the motions of something he didn't really understand. "You folks settling in all right?" he asked, his voice flat. "Yeah, we're getting there," my dad replied. "House needs a little work, but it's nice." Delmar nodded, but his gaze never stayed in one place for long. He kept scanning our property, his pale eyes darting from the house to the woods to the fence we were fixing, and then, finally, back to me. "You best be careful out here, boy," he said. His tone was off, like a warning, but not one you'd expect from a friendly neighbor, more like an observation. Something inside me twisted. "What do you mean?" I asked, my throat suddenly dry. Delmar didn't answer right away. He just watched me, his lips curling slightly. "These woods," he finally said, his voice quieter now. "They got a way of keepin' things." A shiver crawled up my spine. My dad must have sensed my discomfort, because he quickly changed the subject, asking Delmar about the town, the best places to get groceries, things like that. Delmar answered each question in short, clipped sentences, never offering more than he had to. After a few minutes, he gave us a nod, turned, and walked back down the road. I watched him go, and the further he got, the easier I could breathe. That night, Max started barking again. But this time, it wasn't just a growl. It was full-on frantic barking, the kind I'd never heard before. I sat up in bed, heart hammering, and looked toward the window. The trees swayed in the wind, their long shadows stretching across the yard, but I didn't see anything. Then the whispering started. At first I thought it was the wind, but as I listened, I realized it wasn't random. It was my name. Ethan, a soft, raspy voice just outside my window. I froze. The room felt too cold, the air too thick. I forced myself to look, but my hands trembled as I reached for the curtain. I pulled it back just a fraction of an inch, just enough to see him. Delmar, standing in the yard, staring at me. His face pale as bone, his head tilted slightly, like he was listening to my fear. And then he smiled. A wide, unnatural grin, stretching too far across his face. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. And then he was gone, just like that. No movement, no sound. Just vanished into the darkness. I scrambled out of bed and ran to my parents' room, banging on the door. My dad answered, groggy and annoyed, but the second he saw my face, he was awake. "Owen?" I gasped. He was outside." My dad's expression darkened. He grabbed his shotgun from under the bed and stormed downstairs, motioning for me to stay behind. We checked the entire yard. Nothing. No footprints, no sign of anyone. But Max wouldn't stop growling. The next day, my dad started asking around town about Delmar, but no one, not a single person, had ever heard of him. No records, no old man living down the road, nothing. That night, my dad sat me down, his face more serious than I'd ever seen it. "I don't want you anywhere near those woods," he said. "And if you see that man again, you come straight to me. Do you understand?" I nodded, but the unease gnawed at me, 'cause I knew he was still out there. And worse, he knew my name. I wish I could tell you that was the last time I saw something I couldn't explain. That after my family left Montana, my life went back to normal. But the truth is, once you've seen something that shouldn't exist, you start to notice more of them. It's like a switch flips in your brain. Awful, irreversible awareness that some things aren't meant to be seen. And sometimes those things see you first. When Claire and I moved into the old Victorian house in upstate New York, we weren't looking for anything special, just a quiet place to start our lives together. We had been married for almost 2 years, still in that honeymoon phase where everything felt exciting and full of possibility. The house was beautiful in a way only old homes can be. High ceilings, intricate woodwork, stained glass windows that painted the floors in colored light whenever the sun hit just right. But most of all, it felt like ours, like a place where we could build a future. The previous owners had lived there for decades before finally moving to Florida to retire. They left behind a few pieces of furniture, some antique cabinets, and an enormous wooden armoire in the hallway upstairs. It was the first oddity we noticed. I remember the day we found the door. Claire was setting up her office while I was finishing unpacking, and I decided to move the armoire against the far wall to give the hallway more space. The thing was heavy, a monstrous carved piece of furniture that looked as old as the house itself. When I finally got it to budge, a wave of stale, unmoving air hit me, carrying with it a faint, metallic scent. Behind the armoire was a door, a thin, narrow door, the kind you might see in old farmhouses, leading to servants' quarters or dumbwaiter shafts. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of how we had completely missed it during the walkthroughs. I called for Claire, and when she saw it, she frowned. "Did the realtor ever mention this?" I shook my head. The wood was aged and cracked, but the handle turned easily, like someone had oiled it recently. Beyond the door was a small, windowless room, barely big enough for a single bed. The walls were covered in old, faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges. There was only one thing inside, a chair, pushed into the far corner. We joked at first, called it the panic room or the timeout room, but I didn't like it. Not because of what was in there, but because of how it felt. Too cold, even in summer, too quiet, even in an empty house. Claire didn't seem to mind, but over the next few days, the house started to change. Or maybe we started to notice things that had been there all along. Doors we knew we had locked were open in the morning. Objects moved from where we left them. At night, we would hear creaks on the stairs. Too slow, too rhythmic to be the house settling. And then came the shadows. The first time I saw it, I was brushing my teeth before bed. The mirror above the sink reflected the hallway behind me. The same hallway where the hidden room was. I bent down to rinse my mouth, and when I looked back up, something was standing in the hallway. Not a person, not quite a shape either. Just a darkness, deep and unmoving. I turned so fast my head spun, expecting to see Claire there. But the hallway was empty, and the door to the hidden room was open. By the end of the first month, Claire admitted she felt it too. She tried to rationalize it. Old houses settle, shadows play tricks. But one night, we both woke up at the same time. Not because of a sound, not because of a bad dream, but because something was breathing in the room with us. Long, slow breaths. I turned on the bedside lamp so fast it nearly fell off the nightstand. There was nothing there. Just the bedroom, just Claire and me. But the door to the hallway was open, and at the end of the hall, we saw it. The shadow, standing in the doorway of the hidden room, watching us. Claire squeezed my arm so hard it left bruises. Neither of us moved. Then, it stepped back into the room, and the door slowly swung shut. The next morning, we did what we should have done from the start. We looked into the history of the house. The records were sparse, but we found out that the hidden room had been sealed off for decades. It hadn't been part of the house's original blueprints. In fact, the previous owners had never used it. One of the last families who lived there had a daughter, a young girl who, according to Old Town rumors, had trouble sleeping. She told her parents she would wake up to someone standing in the room with her. A tall shadow, always watching, never moving. They told her it was just a dream, until one night they found her standing in the hallway, staring at the door. When they asked what she was doing, she wouldn't speak. She never spoke again after that. That night, Claire and I made a decision. We were going to confront it. We stood outside the hidden room, hands clasped together, hearts hammering. I reached for the doorknob. It was cold. We stepped inside. The chair was still there, exactly where it had been before. But the room felt different now. The air thicker, like it was waiting for us. I cleared my throat, trying to ignore the way my skin crawled. "We know you're here," I said. My voice came out stronger than I expected. Silence. Then a single breath, so close I could feel it on my neck. Claire shuddered beside me, gripping my arm. "This is our home," I continued, forcing the words out before fear swallowed them. "You need to leave." The air shifted, the weight of the room lifted, just slightly, and then the chair rocked forward. Just once, and everything went still. That was the last night we heard the noises. No more footsteps, no more shadows. We never used the hidden room, never opened the door again. But we stayed in the house, because somehow I knew we had done something right, or at least something that kept it at bay. Most nights we slept fine, but sometimes, when the wind is just right and the house is silent, I still hear the chair move. Just a single creak. A reminder that something is still waiting, and it hasn't left. Not really. There's something about old houses that makes them feel alive. Maybe it's the way the wood settles, shifting with time, making it groan like an aging body. Or maybe it's the way memories cling to them, long after the people who lived there are gone. I used to think that was just a poetic way of looking at things, but after what happened to me, I know better. I know that sometimes the past doesn't let go. By the time I moved into the small cottage in Vermont, I was ready for a fresh start. I had spent the last few years bouncing between cities, relationships, and jobs, never feeling like I belonged anywhere. But this place, the little white house with green shutters, tucked away in the woods, it felt like a place where I could finally breathe. The price was too good to be true, which should have been my first warning sign. But I wasn't superstitious, not yet. The house came partially furnished. The previous owners had left behind a few old chairs, a rickety dining table, and a massive wooden armoire in the bedroom. But the most unsettling thing they left behind was the rocking chair. It was an ugly thing. Dark polished wood, high-backed with curved arms that looked too thin to be sturdy. The seat was sagging, the wood chipped. It sat in the corner of the basement, facing the wall, like someone had put it there to be forgotten. I didn't like it, so on my second day I dragged it up the basement stairs, through the back door, and left it out by the trash bins. That night, I woke up to the front door creaking open. I always lock my doors before bed. It's a habit. one of the few things my dad drilled into me that stuck. When I got up to check, the door was wide open, swinging slightly in the wind. My first thought was that I had forgotten to lock it. Maybe I was just exhausted from the move. But when I turned around, the rocking chair was back, sitting in the living room, facing the hallway, like it had never been moved, like it had been waiting for me. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I carried the chair to the back of my truck and drove it 10 miles out of town to the county dump. I watched as a worker threw it onto a pile of broken furniture, and I felt a strange sense of relief as I drove away. But that night I woke up again, not to the sound of the door creaking. This time it was a slow, rhythmic sound. Creak, pause, creak. The sound of wood rubbing against wood. The sound of a rocking chair moving. I lay frozen in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. No, 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 no. I forced myself to sit up, to look toward the doorway. And there it was. The chair. Back in the exact same spot, facing my bedroom door, rocking, and sitting in it was her. She was old, her skin pale and sagging, her hair thin and gray. She wore a long, faded nightgown, the kind you'd expect to see on someone from 100 years ago. Her hands were knotted with age, gripping the arms of the chair so tightly, her knuckles looked like bone. But it was her eyes that terrified me the most. Because they were fixed on me. Wide, unblinking, like she had been watching me sleep. I wanted to move, to scream, to do something, but I was paralyzed. I could only stare back at her, my body locked in place by some unseen force. Then, slowly, so painfully slowly, she smiled, and the chair stopped rocking. When I woke up, it was morning. The chair was still there, but she was gone. I left the house that day. I booked a motel on the other side of town and spent the next few nights driving around, researching the house's history, and that's when I found out about Margaret Lanning. She had lived there for almost 40 years, alone after her husband passed, and she had died in that chair. Neighbors said she spent most of her days sitting in it, watching the window, waiting for something. And after she died, every family who moved in tried to get rid of the chair, but it always came back. I thought about burning it. That's what most people would do, right? But something inside me told me that wasn't the answer. Margaret wasn't trying to hurt me. She was attached to the chair. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized she didn't want to be forgotten. So instead of throwing it away again, I did something else. I moved it. I carried the heavy, cursed thing into the living room and placed it by the front window, where it had once sat. And I spoke to it. "Margaret," I said, my voice shaking, "this is your chair. You can stay, but please don't watch me while I sleep." Silence. Then, the chair rocked forward once, like a nod, and that was it. That night, for the first time since moving in, I slept soundly. The door stayed locked. The air felt lighter, and in the morning, the chair was exactly where I left it. It's been 3 years since then. I still live in the house. I never see Margaret. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind is still and the house is quiet, I hear the faint sound of wood creaking. Just once, and I know that she's still there, still watching, but at peace. I used to think that when you left a haunted house behind, you also left the fear behind, that it was tied to the place, to the walls, to the floors, to the history embedded in the bones of the house. But fear doesn't work that way. Once you've seen something unnatural, it lingers in you. It follows you. It changes the way you look at the world. That's what I realized after I moved out of the cottage in Vermont, after I left Margaret's rocking chair behind. When I arrived in Chicago, I told myself I was finally free of all that. I wasn't in some isolated farmhouse or eerie old cottage anymore. I was in the city. Crowded streets, noisy neighbors, people everywhere. And ghosts don't belong in cities. At least, that's what I thought. The brownstone on Ashland Avenue was exactly what I had been looking for. A one-bedroom unit in a newly renovated building, spacious and modern, with exposed brick walls and large windows that let in plenty of light. It was perfect. For the first time in months, I felt normal again. No cold spots, no doors unlocking themselves, no cursed rocking chairs waiting in the dark. Just me in a city full of life. I told myself I had escaped the ghosts of the past. Then, on my second night, I heard the scratching. At first, I thought it was rats. It was faint, barely noticeable, a soft, persistent scuffling coming from somewhere above me. The brownstone had an unfinished attic, but I hadn't been up there. The landlord told me it was just storage space, sealed off from my unit. Still, the sound kept coming back. Every night, scratch, scratch, scratch. Sometimes it was slow and deliberate, other times frantic, like fingernails against wood. I told myself it was just an old building settling, that maybe I was just being paranoid after Vermont. But then, one night, the scratching moved. It wasn't coming from above me anymore. It was coming from inside the walls. By the third week, I wasn't sleeping much. I tried to ignore it. I really did, but once you hear something like that, it becomes impossible to unhear it. Every night, as soon as the city went quiet, it would start. The faintest sound of nails scraping wood. And one night, as I lay in bed, barely keeping my eyes open, I heard something else. A whisper, too soft to make out the words. I bolted up, my pulse hammering. I waited, listened. Silence. Then, the whisper came again. Right outside my bedroom door. I reached for my phone, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. My first instinct was to call someone, anyone, but what the hell was I supposed to say? I was alone in the apartment, the doors were locked. I wasn't dreaming, but someone was whispering to me. And I swear to God, they were inside the walls. The next morning, I called my landlord. I told him there were rats in the attic, scratching inside the walls. He looked at me for a long moment, then shook his head. "There aren't any rats," he said. "We had an exterminator come through before the renovations." "What about the attic?" I pressed. He frowned. "What about it?" "The noise," I said, my throat dry. "It's coming from up there. Maybe something got inside?" He exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. "The attic isn't accessible," he said. "It's sealed off." I stared at him. "Sealed off?" He nodded. "Has been for years. No one goes up there." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him I heard something moving, but I could already tell he wasn't listening. That night, I made up my mind. I was going up there myself. The attic door was in the hallway outside my unit at the very top of the stairs. It had been painted over, the edges sealed tight like it hadn't been touched in decades. I had to use a crowbar to pry it open. The second I did, a gust of freezing air hit me in the face. The smell was overwhelming. Dust, mildew, and something else, something rotting. I lifted my flashlight and climbed inside. The attic was small and cramped, the ceiling so low I had to hunch over. It was empty, except for a few broken chairs, a wooden crate, and a door. A small, thin wooden door, barely taller than my waist, tucked into the farthest corner of the attic. The scratching had stopped, but I knew that whatever I had been hearing was behind that door. I stepped closer. I shouldn't have. I knew I shouldn't have. But I reached out, gripped the cold, rusted doorknob, and turned it. The door swung open on its own, and inside, in the dim glow of my flashlight, I saw her. She was hunched over, her back to me. Her hair was long and matted, her skin pale and stretched thin over bones. She was scratching at the walls, long, ragged fingernails carving deep grooves into the wood. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Her shoulders twitched, like she could feel me watching. My lungs refused to work. I wanted to run, I wanted to scream, but my body wouldn't move. Then, slowly, so painfully slowly, she stopped scratching and turned her head. Not her body, just her head. It cracked as it twisted too far, bones shifting in a way they shouldn't. Her eyes were wide and sunken, her mouth stretched into a rotting grin. And then she lunged at me. I don't remember getting out of the attic. I don't remember running down the stairs. All I remember is throwing myself into my apartment, locking the door and pressing my back against it, shaking so hard my teeth clattered. I didn't sleep. I didn't even close my eyes, because I knew, if I did, she'd be waiting, right outside my door. I moved out the next morning. Didn't tell the landlord why. Didn't care. I packed what I could fit in my car and left the rest behind. But even now, I still hear it. Not every night, not even every week, but every now and then, when the world is silent and my mind drifts back to that night, I hear the scratching. Scratch, scratch, scratch. And I wonder, did I wake her up? Or was she always there, waiting for someone to find her? I used to think that fear lived in dark places, in attics and basements, in forgotten rooms where the air is stale and the walls hold secrets. But that's not true. Sometimes fear is right in front of you, staring back from the surface of a mirror. I learned that the hard way. After Daniel's story about the attic, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I spent hours searching online, reading about trapped spirits, haunted spaces, and things that shouldn't exist. Maybe it was just curiosity, maybe it was something else, something that had already set its sights on me. When I moved into the apartment in Charleston, I didn't know its history. I didn't ask. I just needed a fresh start, a place to breathe. The apartment was perfect. High ceilings, old wooden floors, and big windows that let in plenty of light. But the thing I loved most was the mirror. It was an antique, left behind by the previous tenant. A beautiful, ornate thing, tall and heavy, with an intricately carved wooden frame. It fit the space perfectly. Or at least, that's what I thought. It started with small things, subtle shifts. I would walk past the mirror and catch something out of the corner of my eye, a movement that wasn't mine. At first, I told myself it was just a trick of the light, but then I started noticing the differences. My reflection wasn't always in sync, a second too slow, a blink too late. Once, I caught it smiling when I wasn't smiling at all. The first time I saw her, I thought I was losing my mind. It was late. I had just come home from work, exhausted, my brain foggy. I passed by the mirror without looking. I didn't want to look, but something made me stop. A feeling like the air had changed. I turned back, and there she was, standing inside the mirror. Not me. Her. She looked exactly like me. Same hair, same face, same eyes. But she wasn't me. She stood too still, her head tilted slightly, her lips curved into a small, knowing smile. I stepped closer. So did she. I lifted a hand. So did she. But then, as I was about to turn away, her smile widened, just slightly. Too much. Too wrong. I gasped and stumbled backward, heart racing. She wasn't copying me anymore. She was watching me. After that, I couldn't sleep. I moved the mirror out of my bedroom, but I still felt it. That presence. Like someone was waiting. I started researching, trying to find anything about the mirror. That's when I found her name. Isabel Graves. She had lived in the apartment before me, and she had disappeared. I should have smashed the damn thing, thrown it out, burned it, but I didn't, because by then, it had me, and I had to know the truth. That night, I stood in front of the mirror and waited. The apartment was silent, the air thick, humming with something I couldn't explain. Then, she appeared. She was clearer this time, closer. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I couldn't move. Then, she spoke. Her lips didn't move, but I heard her, "Let me in." My blood turned to ice. I shook my head. "No!" The smile vanished. Her hand lifted, pressing against the glass from the inside. And then, I couldn't move. My body was frozen, my breath trapped in my lungs. She was pulling me in. I felt the world around me tilt, the mirror stretching, expanding, and suddenly, I was falling. I don't know how long I was inside. The space was endless, a reflection of my own apartment, but wrong. The air was thick and stale, and the light was dim, like a world without a sun. I turned in slow circles, heart hammering. And then, I saw her. Sitting on my couch, waiting. She smiled. "I've been waiting for you," she whispered. I ran. I don't know how, but I ran. Through hallways that shouldn't exist, past windows that showed nothing but darkness. And then, in the center of it all, was the mirror. I threw myself toward it, clawing at the glass, screaming, and just as I felt her hands close around my wrists, I fell through. I hit the floor of my apartment hard, gasping for air. The mirror was still there, still whole, but inside, I saw her, still smiling, still watching, and as I scrambled away, I saw her lips move one last time. "See you soon." I moved out the next morning. left everything behind, but the mirror stayed. And a week later, a new tenant moved in. I don't know her name. I don't know if she's seen her yet. But I do know one thing. The mirror is still waiting. There are moments in life that divide time into before and after. Before the mirror, before Jessica disappeared, I would have laughed off stories of haunted places. But after hearing about her, the way she simply vanished, the way her apartment was left empty but the mirror remained, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Some places are wrong, some places are hungry, and I was about to find one of them. The farmhouse in Tennessee was supposed to be my escape. I had spent too many years in cities, surrounded by noise, by people, by the feeling that something was always watching. When I found the listing online, it seemed perfect. A secluded home, surrounded by trees, far from anything or anyone, the kind of place where I could breathe again, and for a while I did, until I found the staircase. At first it seemed like nothing unusual, until the basement door was just off the kitchen, a heavy wooden thing with iron hinges. I had barely gone down there, just a dark, musty space, filled with old furniture and forgotten boxes. But on my third night in the house, I heard it. Footsteps, coming from the basement. I told myself it was just the house settling. Old wood creaks, right? That's what I kept repeating, even as the sound continued for hours. Even as I lay in bed, listening to someone pacing below me. Even as I realized the footsteps never stopped, never paused, never turned, just an endless rhythm of slow, deliberate steps. I should have left it alone, but I didn't. I went down there. The basement smelled of dust and damp wood, the air thick and stale. I shined my flashlight around, expecting to see nothing. But then I saw it. The staircase. It hadn't been there before. I knew that for a fact, but there it was. A second staircase leading further down. It looked old, older than the house itself. The wood was darker, almost black, the steps worn and uneven. And the moment I saw it, I felt it. That same cold, gnawing feeling I had felt years ago in a different place. The feeling of being watched, of being lured. I should have turned back. I should have slammed the door shut and never gone down there again, but my body wasn't listening. I placed one foot on the first step, and the air changed. The house above me went silent, like the world had peeled away. I took another step, then another. And as I descended, the light above grew dimmer and dimmer, until it vanished completely. I don't know how long I walked. Minutes? Hours? Days? The staircase never ended. Step after step, my feet moving on their own, my mind screaming at me to turn back. But there was no turning back. I looked over my shoulder, expecting to see the top of the stairs, the faint glow of my flashlight still resting on the floor of the basement. But all I saw was darkness. The top was gone, and the only way was down. I don't know when I started hearing the whispering. Maybe it had been there all along. At first it was soft, like breath against my ear. Then it grew, a chorus of voices, murmuring in a language I didn't understand. And then one voice cut through the rest. It wasn't loud, but it was mine. Why did you come here? I ran, I turned, stumbling blindly, throwing myself up the stairs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But the steps? They weren't leading up anymore. No matter how high I climbed, I was still going down. Then I saw it. The thing that had been following me. It was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, or was it in front of me, or behind? I don't know. It was tall and thin, its arms too long, its fingers stretching, reaching. But the worst part, the part that will haunt me until the day I die, was its face. Because it was mine, smiling, waiting. I don't remember escaping. I only remember waking up. Lying on the floor of my basement, the wooden door shut behind me, everything exactly as it had been, as if I had never left, as if it had let me go. For now, I don't sleep much these days, I keep the basement door locked. But every night I hear it, the footsteps, still pacing, still waiting, and sometimes when I close my eyes, I hear my own voice, whispering from the darkness, "Why did you come here?" If there's one thing I've learned from these stories, it's this. Some places are not meant to be disturbed. We like to believe that the past is something we can leave behind, that time erases whoever came before, but the truth is, some things linger, some things wait, and some things are always watching. Iman? Lesson 1. Trust your instincts. Ethan knew something was wrong with Mr. Delmar before he even said a word. Nathan and Claire felt the wrongness of the hidden room before they knew its history. Lucas, Daniel, Jessica, and Aaron, all of them ignored their gut feelings at first. And that's the biggest mistake anyone can make. If a place feels wrong, if something doesn't make sense, if your dog refuses to enter a room or your own reflection feels like a stranger, trust that feeling. Because once you invite something in, once you acknowledge it, it may never leave. Lesson 2. Some doors should stay closed. There's a reason people seal off rooms. There's a reason certain places are abandoned, why objects are left behind. Curiosity is human nature. We want answers. We want to see for ourselves. But some things don't need to be explained. Some questions don't need answers. And some doors should never be opened. Lesson 3. You can leave a house, but can it leave you? Ethan moved away from the farmhouse, but he still hears his name whispered in the dark. Daniel ran from the attic, but the scratching followed him. Jessica escaped her apartment, but her reflection remained behind, waiting for the next person. Just because you leave doesn't mean it's over. Sometimes things find a way to follow you. Sometimes the real horror isn't what's inside the house. It's what it takes from you before you leave. Lesson 4. If it knows your name, it's already too late, Mr. Delmar. Called to Ethan. The woman in the attic whispered to Daniel. Jessica's reflection spoke to her before she was pulled inside. The moment something knows you, sees you, calls to you, it has a hold on you. That's why the safest thing to do is to never acknowledge it, ever call back, never respond, never look too long into the dark, because what if something looks back? Final words. These stories weren't just written to scare you, they were written to warn you. There are things in this world we can't explain. Things that exist in the spaces we choose to ignore. The woods outside your house, the mirror in your hallway, the basement you never go into. So the next time you hear footsteps in an empty room, or feel a presence behind you when you're alone, ask yourself, are you sure you're alone? Because sometimes you're not. If you made it this far, thank you. These stories take time, research, and a whole lot of sleepless nights to create. If you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, let me know in the comments. Have you ever experienced something unexplainable? A haunted house, an eerie voice, a feeling you couldn't shake? I'd love to hear your stories. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Enigma of the Unknown for more chilling tales, because the darkness is full of stories, and some of them are still waiting to be told. Stay safe, stay aware, and whatever you do, don't look too long into the dark side. See you in the next nightmare.